I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got people from all over the United States and all over the world, from Scotland to Arizona, from Seattle to Massachusetts, from Spain to Belfast. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I want to offer especially a warm welcome to our three distinguished panelists, Don Purvis, Joe Austin, and our moderator, Avila Kilmurray. My name is Leah Wing, and I'm the director of the Art of Conflict Transformation event series. I also teach in the Legal Studies program at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And today's panel is part of a series of events that we are holding this spring to celebrate and to critically examine the development, ratification, and implementation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which is now in its 25th year. Our panelists today played significant roles in building the peace, so often quietly behind the scenes, working with grassroots as well as in very public roles, fostering and negotiating the agreement itself, as well as serving in leadership capacities post-agreement to help to embed the peace. Transformation of conflict so often has roots that are planted and cultivated years before peace negotiations take place that the public learn about and are covered by the media. And too rarely is it acknowledged in conflict resolution literature and theory, the meaningful roles that grassroots activists, including armed non-state actors, play in conflict transformation, especially even while a conflict rages, as well as in the transition to peace. We are fortunate today to have a wonderful panel whose insights will help illuminate just such important contributions in the development of peace. It is my pleasure now to introduce Avila Kilmurray, who will take it from here. She's a Dubliner who has worked in the community and volunteer sectors in Northern Ireland since 1975. And actually, she attended the All Parties Northern Ireland Conference that was hosted here in Amherst, Massachusetts in that year of 1975. A shout out to our former graduate dean, John Mullen, who helped to set that up. Avila has a long involvement in the women's movement and on anti-poverty issues. She was the first women's officer of Unite, the Transport and General Workers Union in Ireland, and was director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland from 1994 to 2014. She managed, at the Community Foundation, she managed programs under the EU Peace Program. She was a founding member of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition and a member of its negotiating team for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. She holds a PhD from Queen's University and is the author of Community Action in a Contested Society, The Story of Northern Ireland. She currently supports the work of the Social Change Initiative on peacebuilding, human rights, and refugee migrant activism. So welcome to our panel, and Avila, thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you for the invitation to join you all tonight. And thank you all for taking the time to join us to talk about the process that led to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998. It is now almost to the day 25 years since that agreement finally came about. And I think our topic tonight is really timely, because as Leah has said, peace agreements don't fall from the sky, or they're not just dependent on one or two well-known individuals. They actually come from a whole range of different dynamics that happen throughout our society. And, you know, right through what we call the Troubles over many decades, locally based activists at community level, whether through women's groups or local community groups, were always working away to actually try and build links and to see how they could make sense of essentially what was an abnormal situation that had become normalized. And one of the things I certainly have always felt very strongly about is that the work of the many people whose names are not heard should be recognized, because I think without them, we probably wouldn't have got to where we were in 1998 and what we're marking today in 2023. And I'm also conscious, and our two presenters, I think, will reflect on this. When we talk about grassroots activism, we're talking about a whole range of different things. We're talking about people that were combatants. We're talking about people who were victims, who were bereaved, or were survivors of violence. We're talking about people who were trying to struggle to make ends meet in very difficult circumstances, very often very poor, deprived communities. And we're talking about activists that were out in the street around housing issues and around sort of, better facilities for children and so forth. We're talking about people with a whole range of different political aspirations and hopes and fears. So it's quite a complex area that we're looking at tonight. But it's great that we have two contributors who will initiate our discussion, both very well sort of experienced in terms of grassroots activism from different political perspectives. We have Dawn Purvis, who we'll hear from first, and then Joe Austin. And if I could perhaps introduce Dawn and ask her to share her experiences of the pathway that actually got her involved in the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement. But Dawn was the liaison with the loyalist grassroots. She was a negotiating team member and elected representative of the Progressive Unionist Party, which would have been perhaps most associated with people from the Ulster Volunteer Force. She is a board member of Healing Through Remembering, an amazing organisation that actually has representatives of people from all sides of the experience of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And she's currently head of corporate affairs with Choice Housing Association. But Dawn is also was previously very involved with the women's sector, having been the Northern Ireland director of the Mary Stopes International, the Integrated Sexual and Reproductive Healthcare Service. She left formal politics, in 2011 and is currently on a range of charities and boards. I always say she may have left politics with a big P, but I think Dawn is still very active in politics more generally. So Dawn, perhaps if I could ask you to share your memories and your insights with us, and I'll introduce Joe whenever you've done that.
Thanks, Avila. And thanks to Leah for inviting me to take part in this discussion tonight. I'm really looking forward to our discussion with Joe and Avila. And if I could just do a shout out to my good friend, Tony Novosel, who I know is watching from Pittsburgh. He was professor of history at Pittsburgh University. I suppose I became involved in loyalist politics after the ceasefires were called in 1994. I come from a loyalist working class area, and I was really interested to hear members of the Progressive Unionist Party and other smaller loyalist parties talking about peace, talking about the possibility of peace, and trying to make Northern Ireland a better place for everyone. And it's something that really struck with me, because up until that point, unionism and unionist politics was really separated from working class communities. It didn't understand working class communities, and in fact, because of their policies, a lot of the places where I lived and worked were actually neglected, suffering from high levels of deprivation, poverty, unemployment, etc. So I didn't see any benefit in joining a unionist party, but certainly when I heard people like David Irvine, Billy Hutchinson, Gusty Spence talking about a future for Northern Ireland, that included everyone, not just loyalism, but actually right across the board, I thought this is something that I want to be involved in. So when I joined the PUP, which was really a grassroots movement of individuals who had an interest in the community, working in the community, I myself had been involved in setting up a parent and toddlers group, an after schools club, a community festival a couple of times a year. So I was really interested in ensuring that our community would not be left behind. And so when I first got involved in the PUP, we did a lot of community consultations. So I suppose our grassroots in terms of going from conflict to peace would be split into sort of 3 different areas. So the lead up to the negotiations was really about consultation. During the negotiations, it was all about communication. And post-negotiation and the run-up to the referendum, it was all about consensus through education and awareness. So if I take those 3 sort of areas and say a few words on each. So in our community consultations and leading up to the negotiations, the 2 things we were trying to do was ask the community exactly what they wanted to see as an outcome from the negotiations. And the second one really was to build our electoral base to ensure that the elections to the multi-party negotiations, that we were able to get delegates to those talks. So we went round communities. We had meetings in church halls, community halls, women's groups, men's groups. You know, we talked to anybody who would listen to us, and we got really good turnouts because people, there was a hunger for peace, and people were optimistic. They were hopeful because both the IRA had called their ceasefire, the loyalists had called their ceasefire, and people really felt for the first time that this was a great opportunity and one not to be squandered. So people were turning out. They wanted to have their voices heard. And a lot of things that we heard coming from the community was they wanted more. The most important thing for them was that they wanted Northern Ireland to remain as part of the United Kingdom. First and foremost, every meeting we went to, that was the thing. But then when we started to talk about other issues, and things come up like policing. Policing was a big issue in loyalist working class areas, and the nature of and style of policing was always an issue because they felt that police, the way that the police came into loyalist areas was like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and so it was heavy-handed. It was always police in riot gear. They were always in armored vehicles. There was no soft side to police in working class areas, and people had lots of complaints about that. Always complaints about paramilitarism and the coercive control of paramilitaries, and in many respects, people told us that they actually relied on paramilitaries to police areas more so than what they did the police service. And they wondered then how we were going to sort of reverse that or break that cycle moving forward. Very concerned about the ceasefires and would they remain in place, and you know what would happen if there was a breakdown in the ceasefires, and would we be able to sit around the table. So there was a whole range of issues. When you talk to women's groups in particular, there were concerns around poverty. There was concerns around domestic violence, sexual violence. There was concerns about housing, about education, all those social and economic justice issues that you would expect to hear from ordinary working class communities. And so what we were picking up was these are the issues that we need to campaign about in any electoral system, because these are issues that need to be dealt with, and the community needs help and support with these. But also they want to put their faith in us in terms of being at the negotiating table and ensuring that their voices are heard. So that period, if you like, between 1994 and 1996 was one of consultation. Then when we were elected, thankfully, into the negotiations, and we had our delegations in the talks and divided up into what were strands 1, 2, and 3 of the Good Friday Agreement. So that was internal structures in Northern Ireland. Strand 2 was our north-south relationships, and then strand 3 were our east-west relationships. So the negotiations then, I would say at the very beginning, were very dull, very boring, and you know, we realized, I remember Gusty Spence saying to me, probably the day the talks opened in the 10th of June 1996, we need Sinn Féin in here, you know, because the negotiations proper are not going to start until Sinn Féin enter the talks. And of course, that didn't happen until September 1997. And it took a change of government, really change of British government at Westminster, with a sound majority, and that was a Labour government under Tony Blair. And then Sinn Féin entered the talks in September 97. And I would say that's when we realised that negotiations, or there was a hope that negotiations would start proper at that stage. So our role then as community and political activists was one around communication. Because you can spend hours and days and weeks locked in a building with no windows, and the people that you represent grow suspicious, grow weary, they want to know what's going on, and they're fearful that their leaders will not trust them, or will sell them out, or will come up with a deal that's not representative of them. So during that period, I think from September 1997 right through to the 10th of April, our role was one of constant communication, constantly on the phone. We were in meetings sort of on a daily basis. We had weekly meetings with former combatants and prisoners and representatives of the UVF, just as an ongoing updates nearly every day to talk about how things were going. And as we came towards the end of the negotiations, the final week, if you like, that led up to the Friday from the Good Friday from the Tuesday, that level of communication sort of knocked up a gear. And what we did was we actually opened the doors to as many members as we could. And I remember the talks coordinator at the time saying that the building was groaning under the weight of PUP people. And there was something like 57 members of the party that had come up. And we thought that was the best way so that people could see for themselves, hear for themselves exactly what was happening, and relay that to colleagues and in the community and others who needed to know and who wanted to know. Because it was really, really important as we headed to the finish line that people were confident, and we were confident that they knew exactly what the outcome was going to be. So that was really crucial time for communication. And then just very quickly, from sort of post-agreement and the lead up to the referendum, we knew the day after the agreement, as soon as anti-agreement unionists had come out of the traps, they were really opposed to anything. I don't think they'd even read the agreement when they said that they weren't going to vote for it, and were advising other unionists not to vote for it. And we knew we had really hard work on our hands from that point on. So we held a series of community clinics, and we did these in the morning, we did them in the afternoon, we did them in evening times, we did them at weekends. We shared platforms with anti-agreement unionists, and really what that whole period was about was educating people on what exactly was in the agreement, because they were taking stories from what they'd heard from other people, and believing myths and legends about the agreement without actually having read it. So we were trying to build an awareness around it and an education around it. We were also challenging anti-agreement unionists in the same room, you know, and asking them what better, or what else that they could come up with that they think would be better. And through, I think, that series of community meetings, and you know, it was we went everywhere. We traveled the whole country. There was places I seen in Northern Ireland I didn't even know existed, and we went from pillar to post to try and convince people that this was the best opportunity that we had for the future of Northern Ireland, and thankfully that was proven in the referendum result on the 22nd of May in 1998. So I'll leave it there. Please post questions in the Q&A. I'm very happy to answer them, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dawn. That was great. And yes, just great what Dawn says. You'll see the Q&A, the two little bubbles on the bottom of your screen. So please post questions there, and we'll make sure that we've time to come back to those. But I now want to introduce Joe Austin, our second presenter. And Joe, I suppose from across the peace line, Joe has been active in Republican politics for well over 40 years. He served as a Belfast City Council councillor in the 1990s. He was liaison with the Irish Republican Army, Republican prisoners, and is currently an advisor to the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Belfast, and is on the staff of the Falls Community Council, where he works on peace building and good relations. And Joe has also been active on cultural issues, being involved with the Avila radio and as a community historian, and is well known for his depth of knowledge in terms of developments, particularly within republicanism. So Joe, would you please share your experiences and your insights from the pathway that you followed?
Thank you, Avila. Thank you, Dawn and Leah. It's great to be here. It's great to be taking part in such an important discussion. And I have to say, you know, 50 years in politics, as I have been, influenced initially by events not in Ireland, but events in North America. As a young man, a young hippie, Avila, I watched the Black Civil Rights Movement. I watched that courageous attempt to democratize perhaps what can't be democratized. And I wanted some of that. And I became involved in the Civil Rights Association. And from there, unfortunately, we all became involved directly or indirectly in a violent conflict that lasted for over 40 years. I have to say, listening to Dawn, the number of words she left out very modestly, I have to say, courage, which she didn't mention, and she should have mentioned it. The fact that a small organization, it flew almost in the face of how other unionists seen the Good Friday Agreement. It lobbied where it shouldn't have been lobbied. It influenced well beyond its numerical weight, its financial ability, and it faced into a storm against some of the major unionist parties who were opposed to the agreement. And she's right. She makes the point that they were opposed to the agreement before they even read it. And I have to say, those people in the PUP who led that charge deserve our gratitude and they deserve our thanks. But let me say this, the journey isn't that different insofar as the key to having the agreement accepted and acceptable was the communication with the base that organizations depend upon to survive. And the Republican movement and Sinn Féin weren't really any different. We had a head start, and the head start actually was that it's now common knowledge, and you can read it in any book, watch it in any documentary about Ireland, that negotiations with the British government really didn't begin in the 90s. They began in the 70s. So there was an ongoing, both a quasi-public and semi-private set of negotiations that were taking part in parallel to everything else that was going on. In 1987, Sinn Féin produced a document called Scenario for Peace, had it ratified at its conference. And that document is as relevant today as it was then. And in fact, you know, if you can go back and read it, you'll see that it is the stepping stones that led to the Good Friday Agreement. It was updated in 1992. And many of the things that later became cornerstones to the Good Friday Agreement were in that document. We talked about the peace process. Peace is not the absence of violence. And again, Dawn makes the point. It's the absence of the reasons for violence. It's the absence of the inherent economic, social, cultural, education, injustice that working class people from whatever political background that they come from. Our history of negotiations, when I say ours, I mean Republicans' history, Irish Republicans' history of negotiations with the British is one of mistrust, misunderstanding, and lost opportunities. The Good Friday Agreement, of course, is a very crucial agreement. It's not a perfect agreement. It's something that needs to be built on, developed, improved. But prior to that, we had the Sunningdale Agreement, we had the Anglo-Irish Agreement, two other sets of agreements that were allegedly there to bring about a lasting peace in Ireland. In fact, what they were there for was to isolate Republicans and to ensure that Republicans were marginalized, isolated, and then ultimately militarily defeated. So what was different? What was different with the Good Friday Agreement? Well, there was a number of things that had been different. It became clear, I think, in the aftermath of the 81 hunger strike that there was mass support for republicanism, and it couldn't be disguised. And the British government kind of realized that they had to deal with it in some way. And secondly, I think what happened in America, and not necessarily on the streets of Belfast. The American government, for the first time, began to look at the possibility of being an honest broker, of being someone who could hold the British government either to have some accountability with them, or to examine at close quarter what the British government were actually about. And I think if you look at the current situation and you look at the role that Nancy Pelosi has played, Richie Neal has played, in terms of preventing the British government, this current British government, from turning up the Good Friday Agreement 25 years later, you can see that progression. So to go back to where we were, one of the things that came out of the Scenario for Peace document was that you needed, just as Dawn had said, you needed to ensure that you took your base along with you. You needed to ensure that all the mistrust that was out there, you could either address or you could satisfy the questions that it would ask. Ireland has unfortunately a long history of broken agreements with various British governments and various British strategies. So why would it be different? So to go into to work, particularly working class areas, to talk about, you know, people who had suffered at the hands of British administrations in Ireland, to ask them to take a chance, to ask them to support a strategy that, you know, was high, as Gerry Adams at the time described, high wire politics. To get it right was high wire politics. It required courage, it required strategizing, it required endless meetings, and again, Dawn has made the point, just meetings after meetings after meetings, to go back and try and try and assure people that the leadership that was being provided was capable of negotiating in a public arena with the British. That what people have often heard on the local news had no relationship to actually what was happening during the negotiations. That there was an opportunity to move forward, that there was an opportunity that could be built on, not instantly achieved, but could be built on in a different way than physical resistance or a conflict. Took a lot of work, took a lot of investment. But once you were on that road, there really was no alternative. Once you were on that road, that's what you had to do. Now, I have to say, this has been done against the background, and particularly from a loyalist point of view, I suspect, against the background of people trying to undermine what you were trying to do, trying to devalue what you were trying to do. One of the things I experienced in Stormont was that there was nearly more hostility towards the PUP than there was towards Sinn Féin by the principal loyalist communities. Sorry, the principal loyalist parties, not community parties. And so all of that was the pattern on which you had. Having got what is absolutely, it's a document that you need to build on. It's not a document that's perfect. The agreement isn't perfect. It's not a blueprint for world peace. It's a document and an agreement that has to be added on. There are many gaps in it. There are many things that have been undermined in the 25 years. The role of women in society, the role of the LGBT community, the promise of an Irish Language Act, the promise of all those issues are still being fought for and fought through. So an imperfect peace, was better than what we had. Where do we go from it? Well, that's the question that we all need to ask each other. But certainly in terms of, are we in a better place now than we were 25 years ago with all the imperfect positions and all the missed opportunities? I think the answer is yes. Do you keep on giving leadership to your community? You absolutely do. If you don't do it, you'll pay electorally, you'll pay the price. And not only that, you'll add to the possibility that those reasons that led to conflict in the beginning of all of this, or the re-emergence of all of this, will return, and will return to haunt us all.
Thanks very much, Joe. And there are certain common themes coming from both what you and Dawn have said. Before opening it to questions, and I see we've one or two questions on our Q&A. Dawn, is there anything that Joe has said that you would like to respond to, or to perhaps pull out in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I think certainly Joe has highlighted the sort of the anti-agreement unionism that was going on at the time, from the DUP and other smaller parties, and it was really, it was vicious at times, it was nasty at times, and there's a lot of footage of, where loyalism was actually challenging the DUP and other parties, because they regarded the DUP as people who had wound them up, and got them involved in troubles in the first place, particularly Ian Paisley, who had been tub thumping in the 50s and 60s, and many people who were involved in loyalism, gotten involved in loyalist paramilitaries, would have admitted that Ian Paisley played a role in their motivation, if you like, as well as IRA violence, but Paisley helped that, along its way. So we were in a unique situation, and I remember canvassing with David Irvine during the referendum campaign when we encountered Paisley and some of his colleagues, and they were calling us Lundy and traitors and sellout merchants. And I remember David Irvine saying to me, not so long ago in this country, you got killed for being called a traitor, or called out as a traitor or a Lundy. And so they were very difficult times, I think, within unionism, and I'm glad, Joe, that Joe highlighted that. I think we've both given sort of a pretty sort of overview of a synopsis that really doesn't actually give any insight into the intensity of what we were both involved in at that time. And I don't know how to convey that, but perhaps just to say that it was 24/7, 365. It was absolutely not nonstop in order to get this over the line.
Yeah, I think a very good point. And just to underline that, it was also during the time where we had the major Drumcree protests and blockages, and indeed some of our elected politicians going on platforms with people that were also quite active in terms of being anti-agreement paramilitaries as well. And then I remember acutely then coming back into the talks in September, saying how lucky we were that the politicians were prepared to sit down with each other.
Yeah.
Joe, anything you want to take up from what Dawn has been saying there?
No, I do think that if we collectively are looking for the more respectable sections of the media to tell the courageous story of the Good Friday Agreement, we'll be waiting quite a long time. But I would say this in reflection: there are hundreds of people alive today who wouldn't be alive unless people stood up and said what wasn't necessarily the most popular thing to say. I think that in terms, you mentioned the confrontation that you had with Ian Paisley. I remember a television discussion that David Irvine had, and Ian Paisley was using the same terminology about David Irvine, who had been an ex-loyalist political prisoner. And David Irvine said, I can tell you the colour of your wallpaper in your living room. That was the end of the discussion.
Yeah.
Ian Paisley went back into a box. Now, I think that all of this has been such a journey. It's been a journey of heartbreak and hope and misery and celebrations and parties and all of that. I just am very weary as an older man that we're beginning to see the same people who were opposed to the Good Friday Agreement 25 years ago, trying to rewrite it today, trying to push it back into the corner today. And none of us can afford to let that happen. We've came too far. We've done too much and seen too much that we should allow that to happen. And again, I just want to make this, and I said before we started, one of the key ingredients to having the Good Friday Agreement bedded in was America. America standing by the agreements that were made, trying to make others keep the agreements, trying to move the process forward. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to America and to American politicians of that day and currently for digging their heels in and saying it's the Good Friday Agreement or nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're quite right, Joe. And perhaps one of the learning points that we can give back to America is the point that Dawn made about the danger that political rhetoric can create. Absolutely. In terms of actually giving permission for people to take extreme positions.
Yeah.
I've got a number of questions coming in. The first one, Dawn, is for you, and it's, what does Dawn think about the current assertions coming from loyalists that they were deceived about what consent to constitutional change meant?
Well, it depends on what loyalism or what loyalists it's coming from, because there are loyalists who are very vocal at the minute that never supported the Good Friday Agreement, and would never support the Good Friday Agreement. So they can't say that they were deceived if they didn't support the Good Friday Agreement and voted against it. However, there are other voices coming from loyalism who did support the Good Friday Agreement and who now say that they wish they hadn't, or that they had concerns about it, or, so there's a lot of revisionism going on currently. And I think that's really has been sparked off by Brexit and the UK's exit from the European Union, which of course we know was really a Conservative Party wish rather than anything else. I think Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster for Northern Ireland, where I felt, certainly, and many people I spoke to felt, that the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was actually becoming irrelevant. What happened with Brexit is that it reinforced that there was a border, but you had parties advocating for Brexit, like the Democratic Unionist Party, and whether it's naivety or whether they knew exactly what they were doing, but they caused so much damage to relations in Northern Ireland, and to relations with America, to relations in Europe. British-Irish relations have never been at their worst, I think, because of Brexit. And then because of that, we then had the protocol, which caused some within unionism to express concerns about Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom. And I think, again, that, and I'll go back to the example I gave about Paisley and anti-agreement unionism. There are people who haven't read it. There are people who don't know what's in it, but yet they were angry about it and they wanted it to be finished. They wanted it ended, and they started to talk about it weakening Northern Ireland's position and relationship with the United Kingdom. I am very certain, from my own loyalist and unionist point of view, that the Good Friday Agreement is the one that secures Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom, because it contains the principle of consent, which states quite clearly that Northern Ireland's position remains as it is until the majority of people wish otherwise. And that would be in a border poll in years to come. And if the majority of people on this island voted for Northern Ireland's constitutional position to change, then so be it. So I think what people have got spooked because of anti-agreement unionism, again, speaking out and not telling the truth and twisting things, that it has wound people up. It has wound loyalist paramilitaries up, and it has wound other people up within loyalist working class communities to be opposed to the protocol. We now have the Windsor framework, which is supposed to resolve some of those issues about trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a bit of a fake story to begin with. And I think people are seeing an opportunity just to wind people up, and it's a very, very dangerous thing to do. If you build a war chest, you have to go to war, and I worry that young people and young loyalists in particular are getting sucked into something that is not of their making.
Okay, thanks. So there's another question here from Jack, saying, was pro-peace loyalism targeted by paramilitary violence? But I'll put that to you, Dawn, but you could also come in, Joe, because obviously republicanism also had its own problems to deal with.
Yeah. I think pro-peace loyalism was targeted, and the best example of that would have been during the Loyalist feud in the year 2000, where it was later discovered that one of those involved in stirring up the violence was actually a British agent living in the Shankill, part of the Shankill and part of the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, the Loyalist paramilitaries in that area. And they were very clear that they were opposed to the peace process. They were heavily involved in the Orange protests around Drumcree, the parading protests, along with the former member of the UVF, Billy Wright, who formed his own organisation, the Loyalist Volunteer Force, who were also opposed to peace. So yes, pro-peace loyalists were targeted by anti-agreement loyalists, and unfortunately, a lot of people lost their lives from both sides during that campaign. Thankfully, I think people are realising that if you have differences, then you talk about those differences and you don't resort to lifting weapons. Although we still see that on our streets from time to time, but it's more to do with criminality than anything else.
And Joe?
Can I just make a couple of points? I think, first of all, I have many friends who are unionists, describe themselves as unionists and loyalists. They are absolutely, completely committed to oppose the politics that I would support. Now, that's okay. That's fine. That isn't a problem. What the Good Friday Agreement set out to do wasn't to change people's politics, was to change how they expressed their politics.
Yeah.
And I think by and large, we've achieved that. Now, there are dissident Republicans, there are anti-agreement loyalists, but is anybody really surprised that these micro groups survive, given the history that we have just came through, given the conflict that we have just came through? So the way to see these groups off is to deliver the peace bonus that should be delivered alongside the Good Friday Agreement in terms of education, social and economic justice, identification that people should be allowed to have, the rights that people need to have, the LGBT rights, women's rights, the Bill of Rights. All of these things should have been catered for inside the Good Friday Agreement. The people who oppose the Good Friday Agreement are the same people who oppose the exercising of these rights. Now, my view is this, and it's very straightforward. There has to be a peace dividend. Peace just simply can't be something you put on a shelf and you look at Christmas. It's got to be better housing in working class loyalist areas. It's got to be a better education system, a better health system. It's got to be all the things that people have a right to demand and are being denied at the moment. And who are denying them? The same Conservative government that want to tear up the progress of the Good Friday Agreement. So let's discuss, argue, fight, be passionate, disagree, reject each other's politics, but let's do it in a way that allows us to move forward, in a way that allows politics to become the dominant factor as opposed to conflict being the dominant factor.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. There's a question here about next steps, which I'll come back to, I think. But there's a question from Claire asking, are there still anti-agreement forces at work? And how is this manifested? And what impact does this have?
Well, if it's sorry, go ahead, Dawn.
Well, I think we've both sort of really touched on that already, because there are anti-agreement unionists out there who, and one of whom, or probably more than one, was actually in the last assembly, you know, working as hard as they could against the assembly, against the executive, and trying hard to bring the institutions down. I think, and they exist both within loyalism and within republicanism. There are those, you know, groups within republicanism who were opposed to the peace process, opposed to the IRA, calling a ceasefire, opposed to Sinn Féin, you know, getting involved in negotiations, taking part in the new devolved institutions. All of that goes on, and we can't legislate for what we call the rednecks out there. But the best thing that we can do is actually work together to make sure that the institutions work. And as Joe said, make sure we're delivering every part of the Good Friday Agreement as it was promised, but also making sure that we deliver for the people on the ground. Because in 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement, believe it or not, and this is a sad indictment, really, our life expectancy has dropped. Our rates of poverty have increased. Child poverty in particular has increased. The number of adults who don't have English or maths as a basic to get them, you know, into jobs has increased to 25% of our population. And that's probably as a result of our education system. We have failed to end segregation in our schools. We've failed to end segregation in our housing. So without even an effective peace plan, and to come up with a peace plan to end all of this, we're damning the next generation and future generations to more of the same. So like Joe, I feel we have an awful lot still to do, but the best I think role models that we can be and the best example we can give is that we work together to make this a better place.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, you know, there is more than a casual evidence base that, for instance, anti-agreement so-called Republicans who are effectively gangs, they're effectively drug gangs, criminal gangs. There's examples, documented examples of them launching attacks, not on the British Army, not even on the PSNI, but which they have done, of course, but on the Sinn Féin premises, on the Sinn Féin leadership. Now, if that's not a way of either intimidating or causing this concern within the community from which we draw a lot of our support, there is no other way. And that's the purpose of all of that, is that they wear down people's hope and optimism that real change in their daily lives, change in the political landscape is possible through peaceful and democratic means. So yes, the answer to that question is most certainly there are these forces at work.
Okay, I've got two very different questions. One from Cheyenne Raza, saying, in your experience, what's the role of compromise in the peace process? Are there any lessons from Northern Ireland that should inform the international community about polarization and geopolitical conflict?
I just met a delegation, in fact, the other day, of political parties coming from Ethiopia, where it has seen more than its share of conflict and all of that. And they came looking for the Irish blueprint for peace in Ethiopia. It doesn't exist. Okay, so let's deal with what we have got. We have a document that is a living document that outlines a way to move forward through the Irish peace process called the Good Friday Agreement. That's what it is. It needs worked on, it needs nurtured, it needs expanded, it needs looked at, and all of that. Key to it is that we need to learn to listen. And we need to understand that people's fears, from a Republican point of view, the loyalist community have fears that are real fears, that are genuine fears. They're not made up. They're not something that was invented. They are real fears. If I want to achieve what I believe is the way forward for us all, I have to take those fears on board. I have to work with those fears. I have to try and alleviate those fears. And that has to be reciprocal. That has to be a two-way process. So a peace process, if it learns anything, if it begins with anything, it has to begin with listening.
Yeah.
Dawn?
Yeah, I think Joe's right. You really have to listen to the other side. You know, in any negotiated process, the best thing you could do is try and put yourselves in the shoes of the people that you're negotiating with, because then you'll see the things from their side, and it would help. It helps create a space within negotiations where you can reach compromise. I mean, David Irvine used to talk about the politics of need as opposed to the politics of want. So when you're in negotiations, don't tell us what you want, tell us what you need. We all know what everybody wants, which is their top line, but tell us what you need and tell us what you can live with. And I think during the negotiations, there was a lot of that, particularly in the last number of days. There was a lot of, right, you've told us what you want, now tell us what you need, tell us what you can live with. And I think understanding your political opponent, or understanding their constituency, where they're coming from, what they need. And I remember sort of the last sort of 24 hours of the negotiations, when there was rumours that Sinn Féin was going to walk, and then there was rumours that the Ulster Unionists were going to walk, and I remember people leaving the building and saying, you know, there's no chance of us reaching an agreement. But people stuck around, and they did, and they got down to brass tacks, and it was, what is it you need to stay in here? What is it you need to get this over the line? So I think that's really important, and compromise really is the art of reaching an agreement. And I wouldn't say that Northern Ireland is a blueprint, or the Good Friday Agreement is a blueprint to be used worldwide, but certainly when we talk about how those negotiations took place and what was required, and what was needed in terms of, you know, particularly the courage of leaders actually during that period, then there's things, there's bits there that you can take away and use in other places.
Yeah, I just add to that. Sorry,
Can
Joe.
I make one very quick point? Today, a British minister who is an overseer in the north of Ireland, or in Northern Ireland, will slash the budget of working class people. He won't ask their names, he won't ask where they live, he won't ask what school they went to, and he most certainly won't ask what they need. Now, surely we are better at administrating our own affairs than someone who has no redress to either being elected, who doesn't care about the community, in many cases doesn't even know who the community are.
Yeah.
So there are many things, there are more things that unite our needs than there are that divide our opinions. And that's what we need to focus on. That's why we need the assembly back up. That's why we need politicians, irrespective of how they see the question of Irish unity or not, but we need to be working for the people who have elected us to do the job for them.
Yeah,
that's right, Joe. Just two other small points on that one. I always remember there was an opinion poll carried out by a Queen's University academic, Colin Irwin, and he changed the question from what people wanted to what people would settle for, and got completely different results.
Mhm.
But the other thing that always struck me about the Good Friday Agreement was not just compromise, it was more how you could reframe questions.
Mhm.
So for arguments, I always thought one of the geniuses of it was actually taking the concept of citizenship so that it wasn't binary. You know, you could be Irish or
Yes.
British or both, you know.
Both.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's actually just almost reframing things that sometimes come across as almost like just either or zero-sum game, which was really important.
Yes. Yeah. Very important.
There's another question here again from Olivia. Thank you for being here and sharing your stories. How has art or music had, if any, an impact on the extensive communication and dialogue efforts being made?
Well, I think when you have a divided community, it divides everything. So to some extent, there's a beautiful host of music and art and culture out there that sometimes isn't known to all the sections of our community. I recently hosted an event at a local festival and brought a loyalist unionist band onto the Falls Road to play in one of our festival events. And I have to say that the people who came to listen to them, their jaws hit the ground with the talent of those who were playing.
Mhm.
The same people would have walked the other direction if that band had been playing at a political event. So there's the estrangement. Now, it's getting better. It's getting much better. One of the things that we would do, I'm an Irish Republican. I want to see the fostering of the Irish language in the city I live in, Belfast. I want to see it grow. I want to see it development. The Irish language in Belfast was saved by Presbyterians. That's who saved it. It was promoted by Presbyterians. Currently, one of the most vibrant Irish language grouping is in East Belfast, an area renowned for its unionist loyalist background. So I think that culture in general, while it can be used as a weapon, it also can be used as a great healing mechanism. And that's what we need to be doing and should be doing with it.
And Dawn,
Yeah.
your experience of reading through remembering, I mean, it's the power of storytelling and exchange.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think throughout the conflict, art has been used both as a means of giving voice to activists through murals and songs and bands and playing, you know, as a way of marking difference. But also, I think post-conflict, it's used as a way of telling stories. So, for example, Healing Through Remembering have been involved in commissioning a number of plays, actually, that talk about people who've been, you know, maybe hurt or injured or bereaved during the conflict. More and more, I think, art from grassroots is used by activists to talk about or to get views across about particular issues. I know that there's a young woman, a young screenwriter in Belfast, and her plays always talk about her perspective being a single mother with young children and how she struggles with being on welfare, and the nature of government and how it doesn't care for young single mothers, doesn't look after children, things like that. So I think art, drama, music is always used by activists. It's always there. I think something that should be celebrated right across the board. And I'd love to see more grassroots, more community art and drama being used.
Yes, Joe?
Avril, can I just make a very brief point? In your introduction, your very kind introduction to my qualifications, you said that I worked for the Falls Community Council, and I do. I don't work very hard, but I do. There was a festival in it 2 weeks ago, and there were hundreds of young people involved in Irish dancing and very flamboyant Irish dancing costumes and all of that. Large numbers of them were the new citizens who came to Belfast, really since the Good Friday Agreement. So we have people from a Muslim background, from a Chinese background, and all of that. And when we talk about the way forward, that has to include our new citizens. That has to include the people who have came here and who have brought so much to the city. I mean, and if you look at huge parts of Belfast now, where people were frightened to go to, that they're populated by a diversity of opinion, a diversity of views, diversity of culture. That's the richness of our city. And that's the richness of the direction that we have to travel.
Yeah, that's true.
Totally.
I remember even during the troubles, you know, the power of sort of local theatre groups. I remember there was one in Divis, a women's group. They had the Dolly Mixtures theatre group, and it came out of the fact that every time they went to the doctor, if husband was in prison or son was shot, they'd be given Valium. So the Dolly Mixtures came from throwing the Valium all onto the table in the middle and sharing it out. So theatre was always there as an escape valve as much as anything else. I've got a question here from Anonymous. Dawn, I think probably for you. Do young loyalists new to the agreements and the history over the years differ from loyalists who lived through the conflict?
That's a really good question, and I think it's a mixed bunch, really. I think there are young loyalists who have benefited through education and are giving back to their community or reinvesting in their community and want to see the agreement working, want to see Northern Ireland prosper. I think there are other young loyalists who haven't done well educationally and are vulnerable to loyalist paramilitaries, which and many of which are just, you know, criminal gangs, drug gangs now. So they fall foul of them and are end up getting mixed up in those gangs. So that it's really a mixed bag. Those who want to invest, want the community to do well, want paramilitarism to go away, and want the assembly restored. And on the other hand, there's those who oppose to it. And it's probably a difference between what I would call the, you know, hope on one side and despair on the other. People who don't see any future and those who do see a future. And I think that's the same in any community. I don't just think it's unique to loyalism.
I think you're right. And when we both independently talked about the peace dividend, if you haven't got a job and you haven't got an education that fits for purpose, and you haven't got a home that's decent, and your father or mother haven't got the same, and your brothers are not getting jobs, what is attractive about a peace process? I mean, fair enough, people are not being hurt or injured, but you know, it's the same inflicted misery. So I think if we can create, and it has to be created through power and struggle and putting pressure on political forces, and particularly the British who have their hands on the budget. But if we can create a vested peace reward, then it helps to bed in a long-term peace process. And it doesn't, Dawn's right, it doesn't apply to any one section of our community.
And Joe, can I continue with you? There's a related question here. It says, with the upcoming generation who may not have experienced the conflict firsthand, what advice do you have to ensure that there's not a movement backwards in the peacekeeping?
Is that directed at me?
Yeah, well, both of you, but you, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think that, and we both again said, we need to remove the reasons or start working under the removal of the reasons that create division, separation, sectarianism, and political hostility. We need to do that in a way that doesn't rob people of their identity, but allows them their identity to flourish. You see, my surname is Austin. It's hardly a Gaelic name, you know, it's a French Huguenot name. So my identity is multi-layered, and I want to share that multi-layered identity. I want to share it within a society that says, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, that's fine. And so what you have to do is begin to create those those parameters that allow you to expand, to move forward and backwards and all of that there. And that goes for tolerance, it goes for opportunity, it goes for economic justice, it goes for all the things that, so I believe that's maybe foolish. I believe we deserve the best in everything, in everything. And that means that we need to have the best and want the best for each other. And the best for each other is to be proud of where you're from, what your identity is, what your hopes or aspirations are, not to be a second-class citizen, not to want to hide your name or hide what football team you support or if any or if none. And I don't support any. Now, I think we can do that for each other. I think we can do it if we're free from interference and if we have the goodwill that we should all be exercising around the Good Friday Agreement.
And Dawn, I know you've already sort of touched on this. Perhaps could I sort of give it a spin and ask you, you mentioned at the very in your initial presentation about the importance that people felt within your community of hanging on to that sort of United Kingdom connection and identity. What does the United Kingdom at the moment really offer to that younger generation that may be becoming a bit disillusioned?
I think people are still attached to the UK because it offers an integrated society. It offers all of those things. I think it's that young people in Northern Ireland certainly the ones that I know that would leave and go to universities across the water and what have you, they see a much more tolerant society. Now, people would laugh and say, what the government's doing around refugees and asylum seekers, and it doesn't exactly give off a whiff of a tolerant society. But certainly when young people leave here and go away, they talk about tolerance in terms of orange and green, and not so much about black and white or minority ethnic groups or things like that. But when they do go away, like for example, my own youngest son spent 4 years in Manchester studying for his undergraduate degree, and he couldn't believe the ethnic diversity in the city of Manchester, and he absolutely soaked it up. He loved it. He's a young gay man. When he seen what was happening with the LGBTQ community in Manchester as well, he said that you'd never see the likes of that in Belfast or anywhere else. He couldn't believe the type of society that we were, and he saw us as backwards, really. And he thought, we've got to change now. He's come back home. He's invested here. He's working here. He's studying here, and he's teaching other young people here. And that says to me that the Good Friday Agreement gave him more hope than ever about this place changing and him having a stake in its future. And so I think as Joe said, we have a lot more to do, particularly with young people, because if you look at any of the surveys that are done with young people, I think it's every December that the Life and Times Young People Survey is published. And there's a growing number of young people who really don't want to identify themselves any longer as unionist or nationalist. And they're more and more identifying themselves as Northern Irish, basically because they want to move away from traditional labels that we had for people, and they want, because they're integrating more. When I didn't meet a Catholic until I was 15 years of age, and I was horrified to hear the other day from a group of young people who are still at separate schools that they didn't get an opportunity to meet a Catholic until they were 15. Whereas when I look at my youngest son and my older son, they have a group of friends now that you couldn't tell where they were from at all. Sure. And that's where we need to be in this society. And I think young people are leading the way on that, certainly. They're getting out. They're mixing more, and they have a wider group of friends than I ever had, You know, when I was growing up, I grew up with a mental map in my head to say I was allowed to go here and I was allowed to go there and what have you, which restricts your movements and your liberty. And I think the Good Friday Agreement has really helped that along. Still some way to go, but certainly helped.
Thanks, John. Question for Joe here, very specific one. Was it difficult to sell the Good Friday Agreement to the Republican community? There's a belief that it was easier for nationalists because they got all the concessions.
Well, let me say that I think we had a head start insofar as we had already been dealing with the British government from the early 70s, secret talks, private talks, and all of that. The document Scenario for Peace, which was released in '87, really prepared the groundwork for what was to come. The document was ratified at the Sinn Féin conference, and then it was publicised in both the Sinn Féin papers of the day. So there was that kind of understanding that if you like, all conflict ends in compromise. Yeah. And all conflict ends with not receiving or getting or winning, or very few conflicts end with getting everything that you believe you should get or you're entitled to. So there were a number of things, and it's very much like Dawn had said. So we were holding public meetings in community centres, we were briefing people. You couldn't tell people everything because you were negotiating with the British indirectly and other parties directly. And so there were fears that people expressed, and they came. So the first fear was, as they saw it, the war being for nothing because the British are still here. What will happen after the IRA go away? Are we going to be defenceless? What will happen to the prisoners? Will they remain in prison? What will happen? How can you trust the British government to keep their word? So those were the things. Strangely enough, there wasn't that much public distrust with unionism or loyalism. I think people had a sense that the people who were the real big players who could keep their word or break their word would be the British government. We were fortunate, and I said when I started, we were fortunate for the first time, really, we had an American administration under Obama who took a direct interest in what was happening and had a very hands-on approach. Gerry Adams got allowed into America. We were allowed to talk to influential Irish Americans. They assured us that they would, to use an Irish expression, they would hold the British government to account in terms of what was agreed and all of that. So I think that the most difficult thing was the physical demand of going over and back over again and round again and convincing people. Because I'll just give you one very quick example. So you talk to a group of people in a community and you said, you know, we're confident, this is the direction we're heading. The British government have said this, the British government have agreed this. And then the following night you turned on the local television network and you had some idiot of a British politician saying, we will never, ever agree to that. That will never happen. I remember one very, very famous case. I had to look after a senior British representative in West Belfast, and he wanted to have a drink. So I brought him into a pub. This man was unknown. I brought him into the pub, just more for devilment than anything else. And as we're talking and he's drinking a pint of beer, John Major comes on the television, and in response to a question that had been leaked, and one of the British tabloids said, Republicans, I will never talk to them. It would turn my stomach to talk to them. And there's his representative in a local pub on the Falls Road having a drink of beer. So you had to kind of, you know, that frightened people. You had to go back and then say, like, well, look, the BBC or the local network, they're not privy to what's happening. They're looking stories, they're doing sensational stuff, they're all of that there. I think, and Dawn said something again earlier on, I think the film footage, and there's lots of shots of Gerry Adams talking to David Irvine, you know, standing outside. I don't know why David Irvine, I know he smoked a pipe. I don't know why he was smoking a pipe at that stage, but starting loading his pipe or filling his pipe, and him and Jerry Adams kind of just chewing the fat. I think that gave people confidence. I think people seen that body language as something positive, something that could be achieved, something that was there. The Women's Coalition, I think of all the people who got attacked, the Women's Coalition were singled out, I have to say, mostly by the DUP for insults. Now, we'd have thought we'd have got that place. We'd have thought they'd reserved that insults for us, but they didn't. They reserved them for the Women's Coalition. I suspect that many of the women who were there took the greatest delight in upsetting the DUP, the greatest delight. So those were things that were breaking through. I think the direct result in all of that was a new generation, not a completely new generation, I'm glad to say, but a new generation of people who were open-minded, didn't have the baggage of those of my age, could see that the progress could be made, could see that you could disagree with others. You didn't have to kill them. You didn't have to fight with them. You didn't. And I think also one of the things that strangely enough came through was the duplicity of a British government that didn't really care. They didn't care about us. They didn't care about the unionist community. They cared about the British government. And so you had all of that. That was all the stuff that was swirling around. Now, it was very exciting times. It was very physically very demanding times, quite dangerous on occasions. But I change it, not for a full head of hair. Absolutely not.
Thanks, Joe. And actually, the Women's Coalition had a flip chart in its office, so it had an insult of the week on the flip chart.
I remember that. I remember that as well. And then when you progressed into the assembly, you had a whiteboard with quote of the week.
There's a very topical one here from Anne Carr to both of you. Should a process of demobilisation of paramilitary organisations be introduced now? Very important after peace agreements and never happened in Northern Ireland.
Well, I think you need to be quite careful in this. My view is the most effective way to demobilise people who call themselves paramilitaries, and many of them, it's a disguise for drug dealing and for prostitution and for extortion. The most effective way to end them is for us to succeed. I think that's what we need to do. We need to, whether it's criminality that's clear, let's prosecute, let's make sure that there is a rule of law that's fair and administrative in a fair way. But the success of what we do will be the benefit that people have in their lives. I mean, there isn't any point. It'd be James Connolly, who's behind me on the wall, talked about what is the point in changing the colour of the pillar boxes in Ireland from red to green if people can't afford to buy bread or to feed their children. And I think the success of what we do and what we're trying to do, because it's work in progress, is the quality of life that affects everyone. You're judged by the most economic challenged section of our community is what will reflect our success or failure.
Dawn, have you got a view on that one?
Yeah, no, I think Joe's right. I think, and I said that earlier, by making Northern Ireland work, by the parties coming together and delivering services for people, delivering what we need in terms of economic and social justice, and of course, climate justice as well is what people want to
Absolutely.
see. So I think demobilisation has passed. I think that opportunity has passed. I think organisations need to want to demobilise, need to want to go away, and loyalist paramilitaries have continued to recruit young people. They believe that they're doing a service to the community by keeping young people under control. I think they fool themselves because they're turning young people into criminals. So I think that's long past, and I agree with Joe. I think we make this place work. we ensure that that law and order is administered fairly, and that those who are involved in criminality are dealt with before the courts. And I think that's the best that we can hope for.
Okay, Dawn. Now, I think time is going to defeat us, but there are some other good questions. But I want to end my session, because I want to hand over to Leah, with just 2 earlier questions that you can perhaps both comment on, taking them together. One is, what are the next steps in terms of future development, this to make sure the past doesn't repeat itself? And what would the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement look like? So perhaps if, Joe, do you want to give us your thoughts on that before handing over to Dawn?
I think the most immediate task for me is to challenge sectarianism wherever it can be found, to try and break it down, to try and end that poison that exists, that people have inherited, or they suspect, or they use as a comfort blanket or whatever. That needs to be. So that means engagement. That means that you engage people in an open, honest way that challenges all of the community, not one section, all of the community, challenges their values, challenges how they see themselves and where they see the community going. What would the Good Friday Agreement look like? It would look like a society that is tolerant, that is caring, that has a value that is common to us all, where we cherish all the people in an equal way, where people aren't frightened of who they are or indeed what they are, where people welcome our new citizens, where the days are good days. That's what it looks like. It's work in progress. I think there are wee signs that it's bearing fruit. There are lots of challenges in front of us. Will we get there? Yeah, we will. I am absolutely confident that we will.
Thanks, Joe. And Dawn?
I think we need to end segregation. We can challenge sectarianism, but it's going to continue to grow if we don't end segregation in schools and housing. I think, ending segregation means that we're bringing people together in those true and honest conversations that we need to have. But if we continue to go to separate schools, if we continue to live in separate areas, then you're putting the trust in people to stand in front of the mirror and say, I promise I'll be a good person. And I think people need help with that. And I think the government needs to come up, the Assembly needs to come up with a peace plan and a plan for reconciliation. In terms of the future, the Good Friday Agreement, I think it's up to us to keep challenging those parties who are charged with implementing it to give us what we asked for and what was in the Good Friday Agreement. We need a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. And we need that, and all the work has been done on it, and we just need to bring it forward. We need to look at human rights and equality, because our human rights are under threat now. With Brexit, we need a new single equality bill that brings us, into line in terms of all of the characteristics to end discrimination right across the board. I think we need to look at other parts of the Good Friday Agreement, like language rights, social, economic and cultural rights, women's participation. We're still way behind, and we look at rates of domestic violence and sexual violence against women, the number of women that have been murdered in the past year by a partner closer or someone close to them. We haven't got to grips with that at all. So there's still lots to be done. Lots that was contained in the Good Friday Agreement that I think if we deliver, we would certainly be working towards that society that Joe outlined for us, and I would like to be part of as well.
Thank you very much. And just to add my sort of two-pence halfpenny worth as well. I mean, again, I go back to the 3 core principles that informed the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, which was inclusion, that we have to include everybody, human rights and equality that Dawn has also sort of elaborated on there. We talked about at that time the voice of women being represented, and there still is an issue around that. I think as Joe and Dawn have both said as well, we're now living in a much more vibrant multicultural society. We also need to ensure that the voices of other minority communities are involved. And also to try and get away from this, the traditional party political view that, you know, that power is something like a cake, that if somebody looks as though they're getting a bigger slice, then automatically we get a smaller slice. We kept sort of saying, look, you know, participative democracy actually makes for a much richer representation by including as many different views and interests as possible, rather than just narrow representative democracy.
Yeah.
And for me, you know, with the size of Northern Ireland and indeed the size of Ireland, the opportunity for creating something much more inclusive is there for us.
Yes,
and I think it was part of the excitement around the Good Friday Agreement. And certainly one of the things that I always feel has been almost lost is that first declaration of support, which was so value-based, you know, and talked about parity of esteem and the ability to be, as I said earlier, Irish, British, and both. And there was a creativity that I think we almost need to try and recapture as we go into the 25th year. So can I just thank you, both Dawn and Joe, and indeed Leah, for allowing us this platform, and hand back to you, Leah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. And I feel like the incredible facilitation talent of Avila was something I really admire. And also, I really appreciated that you weighed in. You contributed so much to the development as well as implementation of the peace process. So thank you for your contributions as well. But Dawn and Joe, thank you for spending an hour and a half sharing, reminiscing, and also helping us think about the future, what's needed, what can happen, and helping to water those seeds of hope. To the audience, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I also want to remind you that we have an upcoming event this coming Monday, April 10th, where we will be rededicating the mural that was painted at UMass Amherst on our campus with the community, along with Danny DeVenny and Mark Irvine, coming from the muralist tradition in both the Loyalist and the Republican communities. And for anyone else who is not familiar with the rest of the series, if you just search online for GFA at 25, you can see the rest of the events that are coming up. And we'll be posting the recording within a week or so after each event occurs at the website so that people can see it. Thank you again to everybody. And thank you to Salo for helping us with the technical aspect. Many thanks. Be well. Stay safe.